Well, first of all, I want to just introduce today's session. We're going to be doing the first of hopefully many Wanderer stories, a bit of an interview session with some former Wanderers, some past Wanderers, to give a bit of a perspective on, what the Wanderers has meant for them as a club. That my first guest is Steph Chapheau. I'm really happy to kind of welcome on today's first session. Steph is a long-term Wanderer, has been playing or had played for the Wanderers from 2004 through 2016 and some coaching a little bit throughout. So Steph, thanks for joining.
Thanks, buddy.
No problem. So what I'd like to do just to kick it off is, what drew you to the Wanderers for the first time? I know we had a bit of a conversation, pre-conversation to this meeting. There were a few key people that kind of brought you to the club. Obviously, you're not from Montreal originally. Maybe just give us a bit of a background into you for maybe those that don't know.
Yeah, for sure. So I grew up out west in Victoria, BC, and ended up finding myself at Bishop's University after high school. So I did a few years out there, and then managed to make my way back out west to play a bit of rugby before coming back and settling in Montreal in 2004. And there was absolutely no rhyme or reason to the move other than the fact that I had a good group of friends out here and I love the city. And, I didn't really have a choice as to what club I was going to join when I came here because some of my best friends were playing with the Wanderers. And so, Jaff, Steph Marion and those guys that kind of pushed me directly into the club. And here I am, 15 years later, or whatever it is. So,
and still in Montreal with a family and found yourself a wife.
In Montreal. Yeah, I found a good Quebecois girl and settled down, and here we are. So it's been a long, good run so far.
Nice, love that. So originally not a Quebecer, but living in Quebec now, made it your home, and I guess rugby was a big part of integrating into Montreal for you.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I had a good base here from guys I went to university with, but spending as much time as I did with the club as you do, you fall into a very tight knit group pretty quick, and the better part of my weekends were spent, at the Orge, wherever we were, and with the club. So absolutely, and it became a real foundational group of guys that we hung out with and still hang out with to this day, right?
Nice. So there's some long-term friends there. And I know that when we first had a conversation about sort of your history, and it was good, it was a nice learning experience for me. I played with you. Obviously we played together for a few years, didn't really understand the sort of history. When obviously 2004, playing for the Wanderers, introduced by a few of your, kind of friends that were already playing for the Wanderers. At what point, in the early days, did you decide, okay, I want to do something serious here with rugby? Because of course, we're going to talk a little bit about what you did later on, but what was it that kind of started that, okay, I want to make rugby a serious thing for me?
Yeah, you know what? I don't know if there was a defining moment for that, specifically, but I always wanted to play a little bit of a higher level, just, kind of push myself a little bit. And I played a little bit out west with one of the Division I guys, my club out in Victoria, the Castaway Wanderers. Kind of got a taste of a little bit of a higher pace level of rugby. And then when I got to Montreal, the RCSL, the Rugby Canada Super League, was kicking off with the Quebec Caribou. And so I kind of always liked the idea of just trying to push yourself a little bit further and see where it went. And rugby was always very close and near and dear to my heart for the longest time. I've played since I was like 6 or 7 years old. So I don't know. It was one of those things that just, I kind of got drawn to, the level of competitiveness, the speed of the game. I just wanted to push it a little bit further. So there wasn't really a defining moment. It was just kind of something that I always kind of strive for a little bit, right?
Right. And I know that when we had a discussion, obviously, playing amateur rugby with friends is one thing, and then being able to, I guess, transition or, your needs or what you want to do evolving over time. You said that there was a kind of like a moment where you said, I really want to I want to try and take this to level. I want to see how far I can get with this, but you had a bit of trouble there. Like maybe you want to jump into that.
Sure. Yeah, I think it was, it was kind of one of those things where I was working a couple of different jobs in Montreal. I was kind of inside of finance for a bit, and I just couldn't really find a good foothold. And I was looking back, I'm like, what actually really makes me happy right now, right? And I kept falling back to rugby. I was like, that is the one time where I am like totally immersed in what I'm doing. I love every second of it. And it just truly made me really, really happy to play. And so I kind of thought about it, and I was like, this is a window of opportunity that closes very, very quickly, especially in a sport like rugby, where the competitiveness and the physicality can cut careers extremely short, extremely quickly. Right. So I kind of made a decision and made up my mind that, if you really wanted to try this, no regrets, just give it a push, see what happens, and see if you can, get a run for the Quebec team, and be the best guy, be the best player on your position in the field. And so, I kind of got into that point where we were talking about the other day where, 2005, 2006, I got to the Quebec team and played pretty consistently with them, either rotating through starting positions and backup positions through those couple of years. And I really just wasn't making any traction, there was just it just seemed to be in a weird rut. There was not any progress made, but there was not any sort of backward, push either. I was just sort of stuck. And that's when I'd been playing with Colin Robertson since I first started, and I knew who he was before I landed with the team, obviously, given the Canadian nationals, and I kind of knew what I was getting myself into with Colin, and he became like a bit of a mentor, for I think a lot of the guys on the team because of his experiences and the way he led on the field and the way he played, and quite simply, one day, Colin and I had always, developed a pretty good friendship over the years. And he said, listen, if you want any advice on this and how you can maybe, round that corner and push off to that second level, then just let's go for a beer. Let's go and chat it out, And I think that was in 2005. And I lived above a really shitty bar, super sketchy bar called the Crossroads on Sherbrooke, which I'm sure
is it still open?
No, long since closed, but it's under a new name now, but it's definitely not nearly as seedy and sketchy as it was. But it was fun. It was a good dive bar. So Colin and I actually sat down for, a couple of hours that night, and he kind of hashed out a trajectory and what you had to do, right, to get to be the best player and to get the selections. Right. So, we sat down, we talked about position specific stuff, and then he kind of broke it down into bite-sized pieces for me. He's like, listen, you can't just have that goal of going out and wanting to be selected for, whatever, Canadian national team. You have to really break it down into manageable sizes. Like every Saturday for your club, you got to be the best player on the field. How are you going to do that? And you go through the sections, you go through, what your position specific you need to be, what you need to do. And he told me a good story. It was when he was playing at CCSD. He said they used to have a camera. If you're the guy that they're looking at that week, they would have one camera on you the entire game, and you would have to sit and watch that and see what you were doing that entire time that you were on the field. And that kind of segued into two things he said. He's like, if you want to be selected every single weekend, there's two things you need to do. You need to have the highest work rate on the field, and you have to have the highest impact of any player on the field. So if you can do that, if you can have the highest work rate and you have the impact, there's not a weekend that will go by that you won't get that selection. And so he kind of put an interesting platform and pathway for me, which I'd never had before, right? Together, over beers at this crappy bar. And he kind of laid out a pathway for me to potentially forge out for myself. And that was a real super defining moment. I mean, he's probably I think I told you the other day, I've never really sat and told him any of this before, or maybe I have, but I don't remember. But it was one of these things where it just never happened that we ever circled back and talked about it. And it was by far the one defining moment. And I still have that piece of paper. I carried that piece of paper in my wallet, my notes that I took for 10 years. Wow. Yeah, it's crazy. So that was definitely the pivotal moment for me and the defining moment on how it sort of turned a corner.
Right. And I guess, obviously I would imagine that Colin's is going to watch this, and he's going to probably, maybe you already knew that was the impact that he had on you. And that you're probably not the only player that he had a conversation like that with, right? Colin, we both know Colin well enough to know that he's always willing to give advice, and, based on what he's done in his career as a rugby player, there's a lot that anybody can learn from having a conversation with him, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And he's like the kind of guy that would, offer that up to anybody who wanted it, right? It was there's no special treatment, and he's just that kind of guy. So definitely, yeah.
Yeah. So you mentioned two things that you said, impact and work rate. That was what Colin, sort of advised you on. Those are the two things that, most of these selectors or coaches, scouts, whatever, were looking for. Where did you have to work most? Was it the impact or the work rate? Like, did you have the work rate, but you needed to have the impact? Like, where would you say you were weakest, and what did you work on the most?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple areas. I think it was position specific, for sure. So, obviously playing two, lineouts, were a huge portion of my game and the weakest part of my game, I think. And that was definitely something that I focused on. But I think my work rate was usually pretty good. I was always fairly fit, but like, I think the impact that I had to have and had to make was something that I had to elevate, because I didn't feel that, you can have a high work rate and still, not be impactful, right? You can get to every rock or every other rock and be there, but if you're not doing what you need to do to actually make an impact, then, big deal. So, I mean, impact's a really broad goal to have, but I think, having a high tackle count, being at the breakdown and maybe pushing for turnovers, things like that. But in general, I think it was really just about having it in my head that, if you hit that rock, you have to hit it really hard. If you hit that guy, you got to push him back off the ball. Right. If you are making that support run, you have to run that really hard support line. And those are the kinds of things that I started consciously thinking about before games and in training as well.
Nice. Okay, cool. So a little bit of both there. So obviously you took that advice and you applied it. How long did it take with that advice and the work that you were putting in until you started to reach new heights? And what were those heights?
Yeah, so I think the like I said, I was kind of half sub, rotating between starting and mostly second. I was kind of mostly back up on the provincial side for probably the first few years. Yeah. And I think I got to a point with one of the other hookers that was there from Quebec City. He was a good buddy of mine at the time, and we were kind of sparring, and I for position jockeying for the same spot. And I ended up having a chat with, a couple of the coaches at the time, was Ian Bailey and Francois Ratier. And I said, like, guys, like, if you're telling me that I'm still doing what I need to do and, I'm great, everything's going well, you're doing well, then why am I not seeing the starting spot? Why am I not seeing that? And I don't know if it was a matter of not being as good as the other hooker that was there, or just that, we were in a good spot, in a good rhythm, and I was a good backup impact guy that came in at 50, 60 minutes and was able to punch through and make a good impact. Because there's players that are like that, right? That you can be that impactful sub, and that's a huge position to play. Right. But I think I got that year was 2008, and we had a really good Quebec team that year. It was just like the most tight-knit, comprehensive team I'd ever been a part of. We toured to France. We kind of got a sniff of what club rugby was like in France and playing at a little bit of a higher level. And I started to get a couple of starts, and it just sort of picked up from there. But yeah, it was definitely within about a year and a half that I started to get a little bit more playing time and a couple of more starts for sure.
Right. And so then that kind of transitions us into, you going on Tour de France, with that squad, trying to, again, keep pushing for that starting position, getting a little bit more game time, working a little bit harder, taking on some of the advice that you got from Colin and building on it. Mm-hmm. And then there was, some names put forward and selections, following that tour from France. So what happened there?
Yeah, so because 2008 was, Quebec rugby had struggled on the RCSL circuit pretty badly against some of the larger powerhouse teams like Ontario and like Newfoundland. We would come away with serious score deficits. And 2008 was like a real turning point for us. just in terms of the tightness of the scores, the quality of the rugby we were playing, it was phenomenal. Like we really did, we played some of the most fun rugby I've ever played in my life with that team that year, just because everybody understood how everybody else played, and you almost knew where everybody was going to be on the field. You almost knew what people were going to do in given situations, right? And we ended up having a really good year. I mean, we ended up tying up Ontario, Niagara Thunder, I think it was. And, we used to get blown out by those guys by like 40 points, 30 points, right? And so I think Quebec Rugby, given the two coaches we had that year, were really pushing for more Quebec players to get at least a look, right? By the selectors, which I don't think we got a fair shake, in the years prior. And so with their pushing and our success as a team that year, they put, like you said, they put about, I'm not even sure how many names they put forward. They put a handful of names forward to the Canada selectors for the end of that season, for a few representative games that were going to be going on that year. And I got lucky enough to be part of that and got put forward as one of those guys.
And then that kind of spurred the next part where there was, some East, West Canada games that were going on. And that was kind of when I guess you were exposed to a different caliber of rugby altogether at that point, right? I mean, that's a complete step up from amateur rugby and then just sort of building up over time.
For sure. Yeah. So that year was 2008, that summer, there was, so there's 4 of us that got selected to the Canada Selects team, and we played England counties out in Ontario. And that was kind of the springboard for further selections to the Canada East team, the NA4 East that was going on, NA4 East and West at the time. Yeah. And so basically the way that kind of segued was there were selections after the Canada Selects game to the Canada East or the NA4 East team. And then from there we had a round out in Victoria, actually, on the island, and where we played USA East and West were there, and we basically had a 4-team camp. It was good. It was awesome. It was definitely exposing yourself to a level of play that like you just haven't seen before, right? And there's a lot of household rugby names that because you've seen them play in World Cups, right? And you're either playing with them or playing against them, and it was awesome. Yeah, it was a really, really cool experience, and that kind of like springboarded stuff, for the overseas stuff after that.
And then I guess obviously that's a completely different atmosphere. I guess both on the field, of course, the intensity, the level of play, the standard of play is obviously higher. I also imagine the setup is a little bit more organized, professional, like a little bit more like a pro level, right? Like, what was that like?
Yeah, I mean, that was really cool too, because everything's taken care of, right? I mean, you guys, you show up to camp and there's the kit's ready for you. You go through the kit selection. You were set structure for days of exactly minute by minute where you're supposed to be, what you're supposed to do. And I think the best part about that was the position specific work that we got to do, and the group specific work, which was amazing to get to have these scrummaging sessions where we had the Canada East and West teams together doing scrummaging sessions with the Canada coaches, and getting this focused work and learning from these guys who were, like I said, like household Canadian rugby names, and you're playing alongside them and they're giving you tips on, here's what you need to do for throwing, and here's some ideas. And like the structure, I mean, it's just something I never got to be a part of before. So I mean, it was very, very cool because you got to live, breathe, and eat rugby, and that's the only thing you had to focus on, right, during those camps, which was, I mean, that's like a dream come true, right? You don't have to do anything else except make sure that you get sleep, play rugby, show up, and and that's it. Which was, it was awesome. It was
and
really,
you're walking around in all the Canada stash, and you're feeling like you're top of the world at that point, right?
Yeah, exactly. It was a cool experience, totally, without a doubt. And but like I said, I think just taking away from like the things that you can take away from that, outside of the kit, right? But I mean, the actual skills that you got to take away were really amazing. It was been a totally unbelievable experience to do that.
And then that sort of elevated you as a rugby player from a skill set, and I guess also a mindset, right? Like, okay, this is what real professional rugby looks, feels, is like. you ended up meeting obviously a big group of guys that you hadn't played with before, and that's kind of opened an interesting door to potentially playing overseas. Like, do you want to jump into that a little bit and just kind of like how did that all happen?
Yeah, I was at the so the NA4 camp. You brought together guys from all over the country and all over the world actually. And one of the guys on the East team was he was a French citizen, but his mother was Canadian, and so by birthright he was able to play for the Canada team, or at least get potentially selected. And he had been on the circuit and he had been playing for I think at least a year or two at the time. And my background, my dad's from France, and my family from his side is obviously all French, and so I spent a lot of time there as a kid. And so, and there's not that many guys on the team that were speaking French, so I hung out with him a bit and we chatted, and I kind of expressed to him my interest in playing. But I think, like I told you, before all of this actually happened, I thought about how it would be a great opportunity to go to France and play rugby. And I, shot my CV or my rugby CV, whatever that would look like at the time, to a bunch of clubs in France. And, it was crickets, it was nothing back. So I kind of thought it was almost a dead end. And then I met Mark, who was playing on the NA4 East team, and we started chatting. And he's like, yeah, listen, my club in Lyon is looking for players for the season. And they always told me to keep an eye out if there's anybody that was interested, and most importantly had a French passport, because as a French domestic player, they're not capped on the amount of domestic players they can have on their team, but they are capped on the amount of international players they have on their team who don't have French passports. So having a French passport helped immensely to just get in the door. And so myself and actually two other guys on the team had expressed interest, and during camp we actually had like conversations with the club to try and introduce ourselves, explain what we're doing and what we're trying to do, who we are, and kind of essentially sell ourselves to the club to try and pick up a contract. And we ended up, myself and Steve Piatek who played for the Thunder, both got to sign contracts to go play in Lyon for a year by the end of that camp. So it was it's a bizarre sort of set of circumstances that kind of allowed that to happen. So it was amazing, and that kicked off a couple of years of playing overseas.
So like a total sort of right place, right time. Obviously you need moving up those echelons, and then by happenstance connecting with somebody that was also a French speaker, and you being a French speaker, being able to connect you with his home club opened a completely new viewpoint on rugby into the international scene. So then from that point, then obviously you're having conversations with that rugby club, probably have no idea what's going on. And you mentioned in our call that he sort of played almost like a manager or agent role, in negotiating that contract. And then I guess out of nowhere you're on a plane and you're on your way to France. Like what was that like? That must have been crazy, moving from being a Montreal Wanderer to now going to play in France.
Yeah, that was it was. I mean, listen, at the end of the day, it was just really exciting, right? I think having the opportunity to go overseas and get paid a very modest amount of money, but a modest something it was amazing, right? I mean, it was more exciting than it was nerve-wracking, that's for sure. And I think landing in Lyon for the first time, met by the president of the club, and got brought down to the clubhouse right away and met the team. And it was a bit daunting, right? Because you got 30 guys that are like, who the hell is this guy? I mean, that's what's going through your head, right? Until you get on the field, right? Nobody really, all right, great, another guy. Let's see.
Another competitor for my position, right?
Totally, exactly. So, but the fact that I knew Steve, and I lived with Steve in Lyon for the year, it was good because I didn't know him there very well, but we became pretty fast friends. Obviously living together, but he's a great guy. So that kind of eased the burden, of going and moving to a new place and playing rugby, in a new country, because you had a buddy there that was going through the same thing, So that was really, that made the transition super seamless. And obviously having known Mark, who was living in Lyon and helped sort of brokered the deal with the club. Like there was familiar faces, right? And like any rugby club, everybody welcomes you with open arms, really, right? Once you
Right.
it's like you have a second family all of a sudden, right? It doesn't take long. So that transition was not that difficult in terms of the social side, for sure.
Right. And, obviously as a Montrealer now, if I can call you that, and I consider myself a Montrealer now, we've played against clubs in Montreal that have, a lot of French imports. We all have an idea of what a French rugby player is like. And obviously, playing in France, the culture of rugby is, potentially a little bit different. What was it like, playing rugby in Canada out west, out east, getting to that certain level with Canada and then heading over to France? Was there a big culture shock? Is the rugby culture that different there? What was some of the the things that kind of pushed you back right off the bat?
Yeah, I think, from a cultural perspective, I spent a lot of time in France as a kid. So from that perspective, it was pretty seamless. I think from a rugby perspective, the one thing that was really glaring was how important the sport is in the communities. It is in some of these smaller towns, it is the sporting event. It is the event of the week, right? Sometimes these villages that have, villages, it's a few thousand people, but that is that rugby team that they have, that Fed One team that they have that is it, right? And the supporters that they have, you just don't see that. You see it in minor hockey here in Canada, and that's the best sort of, I think, crossover and comparison that we have is that minor hockey or that, AAA hockey, major junior hockey in, the smaller towns in northern Quebec or Ontario. That's kind of the feeling that you got, because when you showed up for games on Sundays, there were times where you have the whole town basically shut down just coming to watch these games. And we weren't considered a professional league, really, right? There's top 14, there's Pro D2, and then there was us. So we weren't even the top tier rugby, but for that region and for that city we were. And so that was amazing, because you would have the supporters every game, home game, you would have supporter dinners and lunches beforehand. It was a huge deal. And that was amazing to see and to be a part of, because rugby was never a primary sport in Canada for us. It was always, maybe secondary, maybe tertiary sport. And in France, where we were at the time, it was the number one. It was the most important sport in the area, which was very, very cool.
Yeah, cool. And I guess, on the field, the rugby style being probably a little bit different. French rugby is typically considered more physical. There's a lot more forward play. I think it's changed a lot in recent years, of course. There's a lot of money in French rugby now, and so there's imports and all kinds. What was that like for you from a rugby perspective, adjusting? Was there anything that you did specifically when you came there after a first, few practices or even your first game that you were like, okay, I need to change? Or, was your style of rugby and what you got from Canada, something that was well applied?
Yeah, I think, the main thing, and this might have been from a coaching perspective, and it might be slightly biased to have this opinion, but I think what got drilled into my head so many times was, play the ball, don't hang on to that ball, play it, make some passes, be dynamic, because a lot of times, right, it was protect the ball. If you're going into contact, that's great, but they wanted, and this is from a coaching perspective maybe, but they wanted you to push, they wanted you to play the ball, right? They wanted you to get it out, right? And for me, I think maybe it was because I was more of a one-dimensional player going in there, hitting, going down, presenting it, just securing it, and they wanted me to do more. And I got chewed out so often because I would just hold on to the ball too much. And that was something that took me back. It took me a little while to adjust to. But from, like you said, from a forward play, I learned so much, right, from some of the coaches that we had, and especially my first year. He was a former Clermont player, top 14 prop, and he played Pro D2 as well. He was just fantastic, and he taught us so many subtleties of in the front row. But I think playing the ball was one of the things that I couldn't really, took a while to try and get it out of me, but it was that was it for sure.
I think it stayed with you though, because I remember when we played together in sort of, I guess, 2013, 14, 15, that was definitely a big part of your game, right?
Yeah.
Quick offload, playing the ball, almost, playing as a utility back at times, outside of the fringe play, that was really a big part of your game. So I guess that did have a big impact on you from a rugby perspective long term.
Yeah, and I never really thought about it actually too much, but you're probably right. It's I was always an undersized front row player, so I kind of was like almost like a fourth back row player a little bit, right? So I think it would definitely help me, but that's not something I ever thought about. But yeah, you're probably right.
I always considered myself an undersized front row player, but I'm more of an oversized front row player at least by this point.
Yeah, exactly. I probably shouldn't agree with you. Sorry.
Yeah, you shouldn't agree with me. So obviously, you're in France. This is a completely different rugby environment, and you're getting obviously some fantastic coaching, and you're working through that process and becoming a better rugby player. What about off the field? Like, what was that like? That must have been, obviously there's the French culture which you were exposed to as a kid, but rugby culture in Europe from a social perspective is very different. Any fun stories you want to share about maybe some interesting things that happened that you can share? Maybe you can't share everything, but anything about the social that you think you want to add?
I mean, the one thing too, right, is like in the Federal One League, like you have a mix of guys which are, some are, quote unquote, fully professional and that all they're doing is they're playing. But you have most of the guys on the team are, they work, right? They have side jobs. And so the one thing was that all of our games were on Sundays. So, Sundays was like the biggest night of the week because it was, we couldn't do anything on Saturday and you're, theoretically, you're not supposed to really do too much on Friday. But Sundays turned out to be really, really big nights. And, like the French they love just having their casual beers, right? I wasn't a huge whiskey fan, but they love their whiskey and Coke, and it's a wickedly dangerous combination. And I mean, obviously there's lots of different stories. I mean, one that comes to mind was really kind of fun. It was, we were on the playoffs, and we went up to Lille, which is basically as far north in France as you can get. And Lyon is kind of like middle to the east a little bit. And so we had to take the train, the TGV up there as a team. And we went up I think we went up really, really early on a Sunday morning, if I can recall, and played the playoff game. But that meant we were coming back really late on a TGV train on a Sunday night, right? So we ended up going to the dinner after the game, and we jumped in our bus and went back down to the train station. But we ended up we loaded up on like just hundreds of beers to bring on the train because it was a few hours of the train ride. And anyways, we got on the train and started having a few beers, and a couple of guys started to take a wander, and they're like, "Boys, come over, check this out." And so there was a dining cart on the train, and it was closed because it was like, I don't know how late it was, but it was late enough that there was nobody around, but they didn't lock the door to the dining cart. And so we ended up getting in there, and there was like 30 of us we turned it into a bar for like the 2.5 hour trip back down to Lyon, and basically just fell out of the train. And I guess the guys from the TGV had come and figured out we were in their dining cart, like eating pastries and drinking beers and like turning this into our own private bar when we got back to Lyon. Anyways, we had to gut it out of there before anything happened, but it was super fun. It was and that's like the French guys, like they just love to have a good time. They love having a good time. And that was the best part, right? These guys were all fun, like for the most part, were super fun loving guys that just enjoyed a bit of a piss up after the game. So it was good.
Love that.
Yeah.
How long, and you were in France for, obviously you only went over there for 1 year just to see how it went, but you were there for a little bit longer. How long were you there playing rugby for? Did you move around at all, or did you stay kind of in one club?
Yeah, so I played 1 year in Lyon and then came home, didn't really have any prospects, and ended up somehow linking up through my buddy, actually, Steve, was going to go down south and potentially play in a little town called Carqueiranne, which is on the south coast, just outside of Toulon, and just randomly happened to pick up a contract to go and play with them for one final year. And that was a really amazing year to go down and play. I mean, we lived on the beach. I lived with two Welsh guys, which obviously, Ollie, we have a connection in common, because which is very random in and of itself. But I guess Wales is, it's a pretty small place.
Yeah.
And so I played there, and I mean, that lifestyle down there was totally different from Lyon, right? Lyon is, you're in a metropolitan city, you're landlocked. I was at the beach every afternoon when I was living in Toulon, and hanging out with two Welsh guys, and we had the time of our lives down there. That was amazing, but that was the end of it. Like 2 years in France was great. My girlfriend was still here in Montreal. She's now my wife, so it didn't go too badly, but that was enough. That was enough. That was enough for her. And that was, I broke my wrist in my last season. I ended up having to have like 3 different operations to try and correct it. And that was, you had to kind of put it in perspective. I was not going to make a lifestyle or a living doing this. And it was fun. It was great, awesome experience, but got to know when to sort of call it quits while you're ahead, right?
That's it. And you got someone waiting for you at home that's kind of like, hey, are you gonna kick this off yet, right?
Yeah, I don't think a 3rd season was an option, even if I wanted it. So there you go.
And then I guess you came back to Montreal, and it was like, hey, I need to, I guess, get back into maybe reinitiating adulthood and trying to kind of figure out what you want to do long term. And then I guess that was when you were like, well, I want to continue playing rugby after I'm fit to do so. My wrist is a little bit better, and that's when you came back to the Wanderers.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, I came back right away and played that first season, I think. And, I played a few more seasons, but then, evidently old age, creeps up on you a little bit. Injuries creep up, priorities change. And, like we talked about, it's hard to step away when you do, but it's easy when you've stepped away to distance yourself even more. And that's been the toughest part, is like losing a bit of that, association with the club over the years, just because priorities change, right? So
yeah, I mean, the 3 kids will do that, right? And get in the way of playing rugby, or at least, but
yeah, absolutely. So,
but I mean, I think what's great is, obviously you still have a great, sort of admiration for the club, and obviously you want to, an alumni of ours. I want to thank you, of course, for taking us through a bit of a history of you as a player, and I guess the impact that the Wanderers as a club and former Wanderers in Colin and other folks that have had on your career. Maybe if we get a 3rd team together in the coming years when it's safe to do so, maybe we'll get you in some cleats again.
It wouldn't be a bad deal. I would take you up on that. It's been a while, so. But listen, thanks for having me on this. Even if I am your guinea pig, it's been great.
You've been great. You've been great.
It's good, man. I appreciate what you guys are doing for the club right now is awesome. And kind of pushing us into the place we need to be. So it's amazing. Keep up with this stuff. It's really, really good stuff.
Listen, it's our pleasure. We're all volunteers, but we're trying to do the right thing. And thanks for being the guinea pig, because this is the first time we've done something like this. I think that not only have I been interested and in learning something, even though we played together for a few years, learning something a little bit new about you and your rugby career. Hopefully those that will watch this, will learn something too. And maybe there's some inspiration there for current players that maybe want to have some of those higher aspirations. I'm assuming, Steph, that your door is always open to anyone that maybe wants to get some advice from you on how to kind of get to that level.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, listen, there's many more better players that came through the Wanderers and a lot of other clubs in Montreal who've gone much further and farther than I have, but always happy to have a conversation. Doors always open. No worries. Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, listen, thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it. Hopefully it's been really interesting for those that are going to be watching. We're going to be doing these over the course of the next few months. One of the things that we really wanted to do was try and connect, the former Wanderers that we know and love, to our current players and our current membership. So we're going to be doing some more interviews, working with the other players that we've played with, Steph, and maybe even some homage to some of the older Wanderers that we owe a lot to as a rugby club. So I'll wrap it up for today, and we'll see you all on the next podcast.
Thanks, buddy.
Thanks.